Can you hear me? Yes. Buenos días. Esta mañana nosotros vamos a tener servicios de interpretación. Si alguien necesita algún dispositivo para poder escuchar la presentación, se estarán dando en la parte de atrás. También quiero las personas que nos escuchan por Zoom. Ahora usted puede ver si se ha conectado vía Zoom. Usted puede ver los canales que dice idiomas. Usted puede hacer un clic donde dice español o Spanish. Luego, usted tiene que apagar el audio original. También, si alguna persona desea comunicarse por vía telefónicamente, lo puede hacer de la siguiente manera. Para usar la función de interpretación de idioma, los participantes tienen que descargar la aplicación de Zoom en su desktop o en su computadora o algún teléfono inteligente o una tableta. Para ayuda técnica o de interpretación de idioma, envía un mensaje a bobagpvideo.com. Gracias.
Thanks. So like I said, my name is Elby Nye, and I'm with the Water Board in Los Angeles. I'm a manager there. My section includes the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. So before we get into the meat of things, Elijah and Anna are going to be really going through the presentation today. I just want to take a minute to thank United Water Conservation District for letting us have this room today. Thank VCALG and the Farm Bureau for helping us set it up. And I also wanted to let you know we're going to have another meeting on the 27th of April. That'll be very different from this meeting. This is, Anna's going to give a presentation, tell you what we think that the next agriculture order is going to look like, and we can ask each other questions, and you can give us some feedback. The meeting on the 27th is a board meeting of our board. So it's much more formal. They'll be doing their whole board process, other board business, but they're also going to hear a presentation about this upcoming agricultural order and hear any feedback that people want to give them. And they'll ask questions of staff and maybe give us some direction too. So you're also can come to that meeting right here if you like, but that is a formal board meeting. And today we can just be much more informal. So thank you all for coming, especially making time out of your day. I know that can be really, really difficult sometimes. So I'm going to turn it over to Elijah and Anna to take us to the meeting.
Good morning. My name is Elijah Wakefield. I am the supervisor of the TMDL and non-point source unit, which Irrigated Lands falls under that. I'm relatively new in that position, so most of the work has fallen to Anna, but we're both available during the meeting and after if you have questions and want to reach out. Over on the table, we have a flyer that has our contact information, and we're looking forward to hear from you. And Anna's going to do the presentation.
Hi, as Elijah and Elby said, I'm Anna Bellini, and I'm the environmental scientist in the Irrigated Lands program. Before we get started in the presentation, I just had something for the Zoom attendees. You should be getting a poll pop up. It'll ask you if you need VCALG CEUs, and if you do, please answer yes. If you don't, please answer no, and that will ensure that you get the credit. Looks like we're getting some answers. Additionally, if you're not here from VCALG for CEUs, if you could please make sure you sign in up at the front. There's a yellow notepad to put your name, just so we can keep track of who came. And then also that has some information on where to find the administrative draft of the permit that we released on Friday. Okay, so it looks like the poll is done. So I'm going to just get started with the workshop. So this is the workshop for the administrative draft that we released on Friday. I'm going to be going over the proposed requirements. So the presentation will consist of just the introduction and a history of the water boards and the Irrigated Lands program. And then I'll be focusing on the proposed requirements for regulating water pollution from irrigated lands. These requirements were included in the administrative draft. On Friday, our goal is to give an overview of those proposed requirements, both old and new, and then the rest of the time will be for open forum for questions and discussions about those requirements that you may have. So the Los Angeles Water Board is often referred to as the or the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board is often referred to as the Los Angeles Water Board. We're part of the Cal EPA. We work to protect ground and surface water quality. There are 9 regional boards throughout the state. The Los Angeles Water Board's jurisdiction covers Ventura, LA, and parts of Santa Barbara, San Bernardino, and Kern counties. And at the water boards, we call this entire area the Los Angeles region. Our mission is to preserve, enhance, and restore the quality of California's water resources and drinking water for the protection of the environment and public health and all beneficial uses, and to ensure proper water resource allocation and efficient use for the benefit of present and future generations. We have a variety of tools we can use to accomplish this, such as issuing permits like we do with the Irrigated Lands program, or we can issue cleanup orders and develop watershed plans. So this is a map of the boundaries of the Los Angeles region and the different land uses within that region. Looking at the map, the dark green represents agricultural land use. And as you can see, a majority of the agricultural land use is in Ventura County. And it's actually about 98% of the irrigated lands in Los Angeles region is in Ventura County. Irrigated agricultural lands are lands where water is supplied for producing crops. California is the #1 agricultural producer state in the country and produces almost half the produce in the US. And most of that California agriculture requires irrigation. So why does the water board, care about irrigated lands? Agricultural activities can generate waste such as nutrients, pesticides, and sediment. When you apply water to land or when it rains, that water can run off into water bodies carrying waste with it. When these wastes move into waters, they can pollute drinking water, irrigation water, water for swimming, wildlife, and fish habitat. And in fact, the agricultural lands have affected local waters. For example, fertilizer applied to crops isn't all consumed by the plant and can move off the fields. I'll get in more detail into this later in the presentation, but the Irrigated Lands program has been around since 2005, and VCALG, the Ventura County Discharge Group, has been monitoring surface water since 2007. This is a graph showing the concentrations of nitrate N, which is from fertilizer, at different sampling sites in the Callegas Creek watershed during a wet weather or rain event from 2007 to 2022. The solid red line that you see on the graph is the water quality benchmark for nitrate. The water quality benchmark is the level that has been set by law as the amount of nitrate that can be in and still usable for normal purposes like drinking. We want water quality data that is below that red line. As you can see, there are still many exceedances of water quality benchmarks and high exceedances. Most of the samples are twice the benchmark, and some of the samples are almost 10 times higher than the benchmark. The dotted lines represent the trend, or whether concentrations of nitrate are increasing or decreasing. There are some decreasing trends, which is good, but some are still above the benchmark line, like the gray and yellow. Half the sites have an increasing trend in nitrate concentrations, which means that water quality has a trend of getting worse, and that's a sign that more management practices are needed. And this is just one example that I have, but we see similar examples in the Ventura and Santa Clara River watersheds as well. So we've been over what irrigated lands are, why the water board cares about them, an example of the current water quality data we are seeing. Now let's talk about how we regulate the water coming off the irrigated lands. We regulate water quality by issuing a permit for owners and operators of these lands, and we have been doing so since 2005. We currently have a permit called the Conditional Waiver of Waste Discharge Requirements, and you might hear me refer to this as a conditional waiver or just a waiver. And it's called a waiver, but that name can be a little confusing as it's actually a variety of different requirements dischargers must meet to discharge water from their land. These requirements are things such as surface and groundwater quality monitoring and implementation of management practices. Conditional waivers can only be in place for a maximum of 5 years, and then we must go through a lengthy renewal process. We're at the point where the current waiver is expiring. So last week, we released the administrative draft of the new permit. Instead of a waiver, the permit is called General Waste Discharge Requirements, or I might refer to this as general WDRs or just WDRs. The general WDRs have a lot of the same requirements as the conditional waiver. The main difference is that it can be in place for more than 5 years. We have heard concern from stakeholders that because WDRs don't automatically expire, they can't be changed in the future if there is a need, and this isn't true. Built into the structure of the WDRs are provisions that allow for alterations of the program as the need arises while allowing for long-term consistency. Actually, many of the other regions have already made the transition from the conditional waiver to general WDRs with their irrigated lands programs. The administrative draft that was released consisted of an order, which is the legal regulatory framework of the requirements, and appendices, which laid out the requirements and how they should be met. That's where we're at. I forgot to click. We're at the 2021 waiver. The administrative draft that was developed over the last year by combining the legal requirements that need to be included along with input from local stakeholders in the LA Water Board. In fact, we met with Jody and others from VCALG 8 times last year and a year and a half to address concerns on behalf of the VCALG members. Normally, as we develop a permit, we'll release a tentative draft to the public for review and comment. But the administrative draft that we released on Friday is an extra chance for review, comment, and discussion. It's like a rough draft before we release the tentative WDRs. We're setting up a series of meetings and conversations over the next month to gather feedback that will help us develop the tentative draft we expect to release in July. Also, in 2018, the ESJ order was adopted. The ESJ stands for Eastern San Joaquin Order. This order was adopted by the State Water Board involving the irrigated lands permit issued by the Central Valley Water Board. The State Water Board in Sacramento made certain parts of the ESJ order precedential, and that means they directed regional boards to incorporate all the precedential requirements in that order into their own irrigated lands program permits. We've reviewed the current requirements in the 2021 and 2016 waiver, and many of them are already consistent with the ESJ order. But there are a few new requirements that we need to incorporate it into the order, and we've had a number of discussions with the discharge groups about how exactly these should be incorporated into the new general WDRs, and that's reflected in the administrative draft. So also, there has been ongoing discussion of the individual monitoring requirements and the need to incorporate precedential requirements from the ESJ order. An additional outreach has led to the extension, which is the 2020 waiver is an extension of the 2016 waiver. And in the next slide, I'll go into detail on some of the major comments we have received on the upcoming order. So last July, the board held a workshop on the potential revisions to the regulatory programs for irrigated lands in the region. Some of the issues that were discussed at the workshop was water quality is not improving sufficiently. While some trends in water quality are positive, depending on the watershed and the specific sampling site, many others are not improving. In July, we showed nutrient and DDT data that demonstrated stagnant or worsening trends. Also in July, we discussed the TMDL compliance dates, which are approaching, and how that may trigger individual discharge limits. As the potential for individual monitoring requirements becomes a reality for many growers, VCALG and growers themselves have asked us to remove the individual discharge limits in reporting and to consider a different approach. VCALG reviewed their preferred approach with the board in July. Board staff recommended that we retain the individual discharge limits and suggested some options to phase them in. This was based on the poor water quality trends and the level of BMPs being implemented to date. Some BMPs are being implemented by many farmers, like pesticide management BMPs, integrated pest management, fertilizer control measures, but other more structural BMPs like detention basins, tailwater recovery, bioreactors that are often very effective are not being installed. And we discussed the need for accountability and transparency. Some of the board members' input to the staff at the July workshop included considering an approach similar to VCALG's recommendation, continuing outreach and dialogue with stakeholders, including directly with growers, and while emphasizing the need for increased transparency and accountability in any proposed WDR. The board staff listened to the stakeholder input and the board direction at this meeting and has incorporated this direction into the administrative draft that we released Friday. Along with all the other requirements, the administrative draft offers an alternative compliance pathway to the individual discharge limits, and I'll go over that pathway towards the end of this presentation. So now I'm going to go over what was in the administrative draft. Just to be clear, I want to make sure the administrative draft is proposed and not final. We're using input received today at the board meeting next week and at an LA County workshop next month, and any other comments we receive to inform the tentative WDRs that we plan to release this summer. And then the tentative WDRs will go through a formal public review and comment period before adoption. So the administrative draft consisted of an order and appendices. The order contains the discharge requirements and explains that in order to be able to discharge water from your irrigated lands, you must comply with these requirements. For this program, the requirements at the heart of it are the water quality benchmarks. The water quality benchmarks implement applicable water quality requirements. These requirements come from a variety of sources, but most come from the LA Basin Plan, which apply to the entire region. The Basin Plan identifies water quality objectives that should be attained to ensure that water is usable for drinking, agriculture, wildlife, and fish habitat, and many other uses identified in the Basin Plan. Plain language is that water needs to be clean enough for use. Some of the water quality benchmarks are also based on targets assigned specifically to irrigated lands in specific areas using a total maximum daily load, or a TMDL. This is the watershed level plan I mentioned earlier. TMDLs are prepared to assess impaired water bodies or waters that aren't clean enough for a specific use. They set more specific and targeted water quality targets designed to meet the applicable water quality standard. Most TMDLs have an implementation schedule in them that allows time for dischargers who are contributing to the pollution and the water body to attain the water quality target. These implementation schedules vary, but the TMDLs applicable to irrigated lands have typically allowed for 10 to 20 years of attainment of the water quality. We understand that these are difficult problems that often don't have simple solutions. So the Basin Plan water quality objectives are incorporated since 2005 and the TMDL since 2010. The 2016 waiver added enforceable discharge limitations that would kick in once a TMDL deadline has passed. The proposed general WDRs carry over the TMDL-based water quality benchmarks and deadlines, as well as the discharge limitations. This means that in the proposed general WDRs, if the water quality benchmarks are not attained by the TMDL compliance date listed in the order, the water quality benchmark becomes a discharge limitation and can be enforced upon. However, the proposed permit also adds an alternative compliance option that, again, I'll discuss towards the end of the presentation. So how do you comply with these water quality benchmarks? For agricultural dischargers, on-farm management practices are needed to attain the water quality benchmarks that are required by the order. You demonstrate compliance with the benchmarks through the monitoring and reporting. These requirements are set out in various appendices to the order. Since this is a Ventura County focused workshop, I'll be going over Appendix 3, which is the discharger group enrollee requirements for Ventura County, and then Appendix 8, which is the new requirement that all dischargers must complete if they have on-farm drinking water wells. And also just to note that under the permit, you can enroll as either an individual or as a member of a discharger group. But since we don't have any individual enrollees, I won't be spending time on that today. But if you're interested in that option, please let me know after the meeting and we can send you more information on that. But just it's largely the same as being part of a discharger group, except when I go over the requirements the discharger group does on behalf of its members, You will have to fulfill those requirements on your own as an individual discharger. So I'm not going to go into every single requirement and nuance that the discharger group does on behalf of its members. This is just a general summary of the discharger group, of the requirements the discharger group completes. As many of you probably know, the discharger group in Ventura County is VCALG. The discharger group is required to produce a plan to monitor water quality in the county and assess whether water quality benchmarks are being met. This is the monitoring and reporting plan that is in the current waiver, and we expect it to remain largely the same in the 2023 general WDRs. For surface water monitoring, VCALG currently does representative monitoring. What this means is rather than monitor every single farm's discharge, they group farms together based on similar characteristics and chose specific sites and agricultural drains and creeks downstream from farms to represent the groupings. In Ventura County, agriculture pollution is monitored 4 times a year, twice when it's raining or wet weather, and twice when irrigation is happening or dry weather. There's a plethora of constituents of pollutants VCALG monitors at these sites, such as pesticides, bacteria, and nutrients. The samples from these sites are compared to the water quality benchmarks I explained earlier. Water quality benchmarks are set to protect human health and the environment, and the goal is to be below the water quality benchmark. VCALG reports these results of the surface water monitoring every year in a report called the Annual Monitoring Report. For groundwater monitoring, VCALG analyzes monitoring data from the groundwater basins below irrigated ag lands to evaluate long-term groundwater quality trends and reports this in the groundwater trend report. Additionally, VCALG conducts shallow, localized groundwater monitoring to determine real-time effectiveness of groundwater management practices that can then be implemented on farms countywide in the groundwater management practice evaluation report. This is in the current waiver, but we made some changes in the administrative draft to help get the results and the data needed to do this effectively. VCALG also must complete the water quality management plan that is in the current waiver. The water quality management plan outlines specific steps with milestones that work towards attainment of the water quality benchmarks through implementation of management practices. It summarizes existing conditions, part of which is obtained from a survey dischargers are required to fill out, and then proposes additional or upgraded management practices to be implemented that are specific to the water quality benchmark exceedances. In this plan, the discharger group also describes their outreach plan and how they will communicate with the dischargers, what management practices they need to implement, and also the educational classes they offer. It's basically a loop. You monitor, you report, and then you plan based on the monitoring results, and then hopefully the plan is implemented and then you monitor again. We're looking for improvements in water quality. The goal is to reduce discharges of pollutants so water is clean enough to meet the water quality standard uses. So in addition to the tasks completed by the discharger group, there are additional requirements to be completed by the individual members of a discharger group. The first main task is the discharger must implement the management practices VCALG proposed in the water quality management plan. Another requirement for the discharger group members must meet are the educational requirements. The educational requirement is that all dischargers must complete 2 hours of educational training every year. This is currently a requirement in the current waiver, and the training should focus on water quality impairments from irrigated agricultural discharges, regulatory requirements, and management practices to reduce or eliminate discharges of waste to water of the state. In the current waiver, there's a requirement for a certified nutrient management plan if there's a water quality benchmark exceedance for nutrients and for members in the subject to the Ventura River Algae TMDL. This permit adds an irrigation and nutrient management plan and report, or you might hear me say INMP for plan or IMNR for report. This requirement is one of the precedential requirements required by the state board, and it applies to all geographic areas, not just to areas with discharges to Ventura River or water quality benchmark exceedances. Every discharger must complete at least some portion of the plans and reports unless nitrogen is not expected to seep below the root zone and amounts that could impact groundwater. We don't expect many to meet this exemption, and if any do, the discharger group prepares an assessment report demonstrating this and submits it to the executive officer for approval. The irrigation and nutrient management plan contains information on the irrigation and nutrient associated management practices that will be implemented in the upcoming crop year. This is to be kept on farm and is required to be updated annually. The plans are also required to be certified unless your total farming operation is less than 10 acres and as long as your discharger group hasn't identified you as an outlier who applies too much nitrogen. There are different ways this plan can be certified. The first is having it certified by a crop advisor who is certified by the American Society of Agronomy, or having it certified by a technical service provider who is certified in nutrient management by NRCS. Or there's a self-certification route. A member can self-certify their plan after attending a CDFA or other regional board executive officer approved training program that is specific to nutrient plan certification. This course can also count towards the annual required 2 hours of educational training that I just went over earlier. Or a member can also self-certify a plan saying it adheres to specific field-specific recommendation from NRCS or the UC Co-op extension. So in addition to the plan, every discharger must submit an irrigation and nutrient management report. The irrigation nutrient management report is something that the discharger must fill out annually and submit to their discharger group. It contains information that the discharger group uses to calculate what we call the applied removed nitrogen ratio or the applied removed nitrogen difference. This is used to calculate how much nitrogen could be transported into the surface and groundwater. Every discharger must report the total nitrogen applied to their field from any source such as organic amendments, synthetic fertilizers, manure, and irrigation water. Total nitrogen applied is then compared to the total nitrogen removed and is used to develop the nitrogen applied removed ratio and nitrogen applied removed difference I mentioned just a second ago. Also, every discharger must report their crop yield unless they meet an exemption. The crop yield is used by the discharger group to calculate that total nitrogen removed that's used in the ratios and the differences. There are exemptions that are located in Appendix 3 of the administrative draft, but I'm not going to go into detail about these exemptions right now. But if you have questions on them, we can discuss it in the discussion portion of the workshop, or alternatively, you can call or email me. The last big requirement, other than the TMDLs, is the drinking water well sampling requirement. And this is a new requirement that also comes from the ESJ order. All dischargers with on-farm domestic drinking water wells must fill this requirement. The requirement is laid out in detail in Appendix 8 of the administrative draft. In summary, the purpose of this requirement is to identify drinking water supply wells that have nitrate concentrations exceeding 10 milligrams of liters of nitrite as nitrogen, and notify well users of the potential for human health impact. This is an annual requirement. All dischargers with on-farm drinking water supply wells samples until all the on-farm drinking water supply well samples are below 8 milligrams per liter for 3 consecutive years. And then it becomes a requirement every 5 years. If there's an exceedance, the owners or operators of the wells must provide notice to the users within 10 days, and they must send a copy of the notice to the regional board. So if you recall, I spoke about water quality benchmarks, where water quality benchmarks come from in the beginning of the presentation. The goal of the monitoring and reporting requirement in the water quality management plan is to ensure that the water quality benchmarks are met. They come from either the basin plan or a TMDL. If they come from a TMDL, then they have a date in which the water quality benchmark should be met, or rather a date when the water quality benchmark changes from a goal to a limitation. Water quality benchmarks are in areas that are subject to TMDL must be met by the client state. These are the TMDLs in Ventura County. that found that agriculture was a source of some of the pollution that the TMDL addressed. Also here are their compliance dates. The requirements that are required after there's a water quality benchmark exceedance in a TMDL area in which the compliance date has passed has been heavily discussed at various meetings and workshops leading up to this administrative draft. These requirements are usually called individual monitoring and are the component we've had the most comments on. On one hand, growers and VCALC have advocated dropping these requirements, and on the other end of the spectrum, environmental groups have strongly advocated for their inclusion due to the widespread and continued exceedances. After hearing stakeholder and board feedback at the July 2022 workshop, board staff added an alternative path of compliance to the current waiver requirements in the administrative draft. These additional requirements are called individual discharge limitation reporting and are laid out in Appendix 3, Section 3. The discharger can choose to either complete what we call Track 1, which is the implementation of individual monitoring and reporting, which is in the current waiver, or they can choose to fulfill Track 2 requirement, which is an implementation of individual management practice plans, which was added again in response to stakeholder and board feedback to fulfill the individual discharge limitation reporting requirements. So I'll first go over Track 1, which is the individual monitoring and reporting plans. This is edge of field sampling. This is currently in the waiver as the requirement after a TMDL deadline has passed and there's a water quality benchmark exceedance. If the discharger chooses this track, they must submit individual monitoring and reporting plan and a quality assurance plan, or a QAPP, within 3 months of the documented exceedance to the regional board. An exceedance is considered documented when the lab analysis is received by the discharger group. The discharger group must provide notice to the members represented by the discharger group monitoring site with the exceedance that they are subject to individual discharge limitation reporting within 10 days. Members must begin implementation of the monitoring and reporting plans within 60 days of executive officer approval of the plan. Individual monitoring and reporting plan is specific to the constituent or pollutant that had the exceedance, meaning you don't have to monitor all the pollutants VCALC does, only the ones that were subject to a TMDL compliance date and had an exceedance. The water quality benchmark exceedance occurred during a dry weather event. 2 samples shall be collected in dry weather, which is when irrigation is happening. Or if it happened in wet weather, then 2 samples should be collected during wet weather events. And if there's exceedance occurred both in wet and dry weather event, then 4 samples, 2 during wet, 2 during dry, shall be collected per year. In addition to the monitoring and reporting plan, you must submit an individual annual monitoring report that summarizes the results of your sampling annually. Samples shall be collected until water quality benchmarks are attained at each individual discharge monitoring point for 2 consecutive years. This is Track 2. This is the new track that we added and is an alternative compliance path. If the discharger group chooses a track, or the discharger, chooses this track, they must submit an individual management practice plan within 3 months of the documented exceedance to the regional board. As I mentioned previously, the exceedance is considered documented when the lab analysis is received by the discharger group. Discharger group must provide notice to the members represented by the discharger group monitoring site with the exceedance that they are subject to individual discharge limitation reporting within 10 days. The management practice plans must be fully implemented within 6 months of executive officer approval of the plan. These management practice plans are farm level and are required to be certified. The MPPs, or the plans, are specific to the constituent that was exceeded and shall include structural management practices. The management practice plans must be certified by a professional expert in the field. This could include an RCD or NRCS staff or an equivalent professional expert. The knowledge and experience the expert must have is specific to the constituent or pollutant to be addressed and is discussed in detail in Appendix 3. Once the management practice plan is filled out and certified, it is submitted to the regional board for final approval. Sites included in the individual management practice plan are subject to inspection by the regional board. If inspections show that the entire management practice plan is not being implemented as approved, members are subject to enforcement. If inspections or discharge group monitoring data show water quality is not improving, an updated management practice is required. And I just wanted to reiterate that everything I just went through is proposed and not final. And now we'd just like to open the floor for questions and discussion on what you think of the proposed requirements. Also, that's my contact information and my supervisor, Elijah's.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
For the track 2 option, everyone's information will be due at a certain time, so that 3-month compliance period will obviously begin at a certain time for growers of different commodities in different regions, so different parts of the county. So can you imagine what it would be like for our shoestring operated NRCS, RCD staff to respond to different commodities, different size operations, and in order to be in compliance? Why is it not a 6-month, 1-year timeline? And what resources financially, logistically are going to be provided to the NRCS or RCD to support that demand?
We definitely considered the demand on NRCS and RCD, and we had added the equivalent professional expert kind of to help with that. So it doesn't have to only be through RCD or NRCS. As far as the funding goes, I'm gonna maybe ask LB.
We haven't identified any additional funding other than what's, normally available through the State Water Board for that action. Though I will mention, we also discussed this with NRCS and RCD, and they really supported this. They, this kind of work is that's their work. That's what they do. So, yes, lots of things. Thank you. Maybe oh yeah.
So a lot of these areas that you're monitoring, waterways, groundwater, have multiple inputs of nutrients and some of these components, industrial, urban, county infrastructure that impacts the waterways. How are you segregating the sources of impacts and assigning responsibility strictly to ag when the sources of impacts are probably from a variety of sources, and not just those sources, but also places that are not, that don't have POTW. So the significant portion of the county are on septic, and those also create impacts both to surface water and groundwater. So how are you going to segregate those impacts and assign responsibility through this program?
Well, for those areas that have TMDLs, that's basically what a TMDL does, right? It does a source analysis and it sets discharge limits for every potential source. We do have a program that works on septics, identifying which ones are, that's, where we have oversight. It's mostly the counties and the local municipalities are actually directly regulating the segment, the septics, but there's a program for that to help identify the troublesome ones and make sure that they're, at least a certain distance from any impaired waters, and in certain circumstances, they have to use advanced treatment. So there's a program for that. And certainly for POTWs, they have limits, and sometimes their limits are based on what's in the TMDL, if there's a TMDL that's in their area. So that's kind of done through the TMDL. But I think I haven't answered your question. No, not at all. Okay, so
How are you going to segregate those impacts? I mean, you're assigning responsibility to these impacts strictly to ag. How are you going to segregate those with this program?
Well, if you do individual monitoring, if you choose individual monitoring, if you're concerned about that, you can test the water that's coming off of your field, right? And you'll know. Okay, I'm not getting what you're asking. I apologize.
I have 22 miles of Ventura waterway and no sampling locations. How are you segregating? How are you segregating these impacts? You have POTWs, you have septics, you have industry, you have 75% of that watershed is natural, and that's not been characterized. It's subject to things like fire, runoff impacts associated with all sorts of things. Roadways, there's a lot of sources of impact that you're assigning to the ag community that don't originate in the ag community.
Yeah, so I do know, I think you're asking about the sites, the sampling sites and the representative sampling, if I'm understanding this correctly. Mhm.
Well, it's ag responsibility to segregate and identify. Say you want to go to individual water, there are thousands of sites along these waterways. You can't possibly take all that data, characterize all the impacts of every single thing.
But
It's not possible.
we do assign limits to POTWs, to Caltrans that runs the roadways, to the municipalities that have stormwater discharges. They also have limits. They have MPDS permits that are also waste discharge requirements. So they're under both federal and state regulation, but they do have limits on all of these things. Yeah, but we know what they're doing end of pipe, and we know what's in the receiving water. No. No, just like we at this time, we do representative sampling with the farms.
Okay, so it spins back to the point.
Yeah.
There's a lot that appears hasn't had a chance to do this, but it appears that you're signing all of these impacts that run on and the surface water in the ag.
We're definitely not doing that. Definitely not. It's assigned also to MS4, the municipal stormwater, to Caltrans, to POTWs, sort of indirectly to the septic tanks, but.
There's an exceedance on a waterway, or there's going to be an effort part of the board to go back to, obviously there's protocol system to go back to individual ratings. We're going to do its part, go back then to the MS4 movement over to Caltrans and everyone else and say, gee, you guys also have an impact.
There are provisions in all of those permits for when there's exceedances in the receiving water to. It'll be made by the permittees, by the MS4 permittees or the Caltrans permittee or we usually tell them to do the work that demonstrates that either they're contributing or not contributing to an exceedance.
All growers will have to individually monitor for 3 years to prove that they're not the source.
Well, they'll have to monitor to show what's coming off of their farm and whether or not it causes or contributes to the exceedance, right? Yeah, that's right. Yes. Yes. How do you, but you don't want to know. You don't want to know if it's coming from the property. So we can't hear. So we're going to do a two.
Say you have a 30-mile-long waterway.
Yeah.
And you get a detection, maybe you get an exceedance somewhere at the tail end of this waterway.
Mhm.
You have 30 miles of cities, industry, farms, all sorts of contributors, potential contributors, some of which may or may not be contributing at all. Are you really going to sort through 30 miles of people to figure that out?
So you're saying that we have a shortage of data to act on?
No,
No?
I'm saying you're describing, you're ascribing an exceedance without assessment. You're assigning.
Okay, then what's your idea on how we assess that? How should we assess it before we assign the, say farmers have to do something?
I'm just saying you're assigning all of that responsibility to the individual farms where there are other contributors, the potential for other contributors to that program. Is there going to be an assessment within the regulatory community to source and filter out where this might be coming from? Because it may or may not be coming from an individual farm, or it may be none of these places are contributing, yet the total from all discharges results in an exceedance.
Okay, did you want to add?
So I think his question is that agriculture is being required to do all this edge monitoring. But I don't hear Caltrans being required to do it. I don't hear the cities are being required to do those same discharge and edge of their source monitoring. So does Caltrans have every place that they've now created groundwater detention basins
well,
essentially? Will they monitor those the same way we're required to?
They monitor in the receiving waters. And when the receiving, this is what you're talking about, it's not, downstream from discharges where there are many contributors. And if there's an exceedance, then they have to go back and check their specific outlets. That's in their permit also. And I know I haven't satisfied you at all. But
You have an entire river with no sample.
Yeah, yeah.
So
So I want to say, you just have a question, but you don't.
I don't see.
Yeah.
In this framework.
Yeah.
And I understand your mission. I understand your mission. And I think VCAL has done a good job of helping the ag community try to meet this, but I don't see. First of all, I think you're assigning far too much responsibility to the individual grower. It's not possible for every single, this county is a checkerboard of small properties and small operators. It's not possible to sit there and go through everyone if you were going to really enforce individual monitoring. It's just not physically possible. So I think, VCAL's approach with the management practices is the most effective.
Yeah.
But still, I don't see from a regulatory perspective, I see too much responsibility landing on ag because there are too many other inputs that are not being characterized, that are you as a regulator are not collecting data for, not understanding where these impacts might be coming from.
I can try to add a little.
Okay.
I am only super familiar with the irrigated lands program, so I'll speak to that. But the TMDLs from where apply load allocations to multiple sources, not just agriculture. So the water quality benchmarks that are being asked for agricultural discharges to attain are from the load allocations specifically for agricultural discharges. So the TMDL goes through all different types of the people who are discharging to the TMDL area and assigns all the different industries that have been identified as a source of pollution. Different load allocations, they can be the same, but they can be different depending on the industry. So that's where those water quality benchmarks are coming from. And it's a specific agricultural discharger load allocation. So that's.
Okay, let me switch over. Oh, okay. Oh, question?
Also, sorry, I'm just gonna cut in. If you have a question on Zoom, please ask it through the Q&A. And we're monitoring that too, and we'll try to answer.
And we'll take a break occasionally to answer questions from Zoom. Nope. You want? There, now you're green. You're good.
Okay, so I was guessing that your answer would be separate load allocations for each industry that are added up. That makes a lot of sense, but I want to ask then, who did that science, when, and does the TMDL ever get updated? Because all of a sudden there's more industry in this watershed that was there 10 years ago, that kind of thing.
Yeah, the TMDLs were done by water board staff with a lot of input from stakeholders and approved by our boards. And, you know, it depends on the TMDL. Some of them, you know, I think we started 2003, 2004, 2005. Some of them are old. A lot of them have been updated, and we do go back and update them periodically. They're plans, really. So plans need to change sometimes. So we do go back and redo them. And matter of fact, that's a thing to think about. If there's one in the TMDL in particular that you're like, this one doesn't make sense, you know, let us know which ones you think, you know, need to be updated the most. There's a lot of TMDLs in our region. We don't update them constantly all the time every year, but we can update them when we need to.
So I feel like if I am a farmer and I have an area where I know could potentially be a serious problem, I'm not going to sample water from that specific area. I also think that, I mean, we do food safety water testing, and I've accidentally contaminated my own water sample. I have switched samples by accident. I mean, I think there's a lot of room for it's not real data because it's not scientifically collected. And that's what I loved about when VCAG does it. They're doing real scientific sampling, and you're not going to get valid information coming off of individual farms.
I hear what you're saying. I do, you know, we definitely only want data that's really valid. And, you know, when you have your sampling done by lots and lots of different people, sometimes you'll get some data that's not, you know, some protocol hasn't been followed. We do often depend on data that are collected by citizens. You know, the protocols that you need to follow, or you can learn them to get good data. But I do hear what you're saying, and that is an advantage of the other pathway, is that you're not learning, you know, protocols for managing data and making sure you're following the sampling, you know, regimes and getting things to the lab on time and so forth. So I hear what you're saying. We have a question from Zoom, maybe? Change things up?
Well, there was a question in terms of whether or not, sorry. There was a question of whether or not.
Yep, make it green. There.
Sorry. Whether or not the documents are available online. They are. We posted them Friday. A lot of people in the area are signed up to our notification system. It used to be called Lyris. That has been transitioned to a new system. So if you did not get a notice Friday, the documents are available online. And if you didn't get a notice and you have previously, you're welcome to reach out to me and let us know. We're trying to make sure people are getting those notifications.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I'm sure you discussed this, but for example, on the nitrate levels of 10 for drinking water standard, is that only for wells, or is that also for discharge down the waterways?
It's for wells for sure. Discharges on the waterways, for the most part, it's 10, unless there's a TMDL that I'm not aware. There might be a special one if it's a TMDL.
If there's a TMDL, the TMDL probably set a number much lower than 10. But in the absence of a TMDL and for drinking water sources like wells, it's 10, because that's the drinking water level, you know, for protection of human health.
And that's for the LA regional area that we're talking about, right? It's not statewide.
10, I think, is 10 is It's definitely statewide.
Okay, for drinking water wells, yes, but my question very specifically is the waterways that we're all talking about, like you described, 30 or 20 miles or thousands of acres draining a couple sections on its way out to Point Magoo.
Yeah.
Or out through Port Wayne, out that area, or Ventura River, that has to maintain a level of 10 or less.
If there's no TMDL, because the basin plan says 10, but most TMDLs, if the TMDL has been developed for that watershed, and there are a lot of nitrogen TMDLs out there, it's a number lower than 10. Because the TMDL looks at not just protection of human health, which is 10, but are algae blooms happening and are the aquatic organisms protected? So it's more complicated because 10 is just human health.
In the world of using water wisely,
Mhm.
whether it's drip irrigation or other mini sprinklers for it, nobody's wanting to put extra water out there.
Yeah.
So we have all this beautiful rain flushing our tile systems and stuff. That's what it's made for, is drain those salts and get them out of here. So now you're asking, or my interpretation is now you're saying that we need to treat all that before it gets to an end point, so we don't have issues with the levels you're describing.
Yeah.
And you're gonna have enough labs and support from staff to help us with that?
To do monitoring?
There's several layers to this. There's treatment levels, there's lab levels of information, there's, organizing the group to get everybody on the same page. It's a lot of process and effort and time.
Yeah. I know. It's a big deal if you take on individual monitoring.
Or even group monitoring. It's.
Yeah. Oh, in the back. Got a hand raised. Ah, excellent. Use that.
Hi, I had a question about the water well sampling. I have a couple questions. I operate a mutual and we're already subject to water quality testing for our drinking water through the county and the state. And I'm wondering, is it only an exceedance of 10 parts per million, or that'll require reporting to your board? Or are we going to have an additional reporting requirement regardless of an exceedance?
So if there is an exceedance, you have to report it to the well users and to the board of 10. And I would need to get back to you on the other specifics if you give me your name and I can send it to you. I don't have it off the top of my head.
Okay. My other question was, I'm trying to wrap my head around the two paths for edge of field. And much of my farming is in the Ventura River watershed. And if we have an algae TMDL exceedance at the river mouth, is that going to trigger edge of field, say up on San Antonio Creek? Can you help me understand when edge of field sampling would be triggered?
Yeah, so edge of field sampling will be triggered when there's exceedance at the discharger group monitoring site for the area that the TMD that you're in. So if there's an exceedance at the discharger group monitoring site, after a TMDL compliance date, so I don't know the Ventura River algae one off the top of my head, but after that date, if there's an exceedance, that's when you can choose either track 1 or track 2 to do the monitoring.
So if they're sampling at the river mouth and they're sampling way up in the Ojai Basin, if there's a positive at the river mouth, that would trigger sampling or the different conditions for track 1 and 2 all the way up the watershed? Or would it be that if you're a user and you're above one of the additional sampling sites, one of the upstream sampling sites, you would be off the hook? You follow what I'm saying?
The monitoring sites are the ones that were established with VCALC to represent a certain, proportion of farm fields. So it's not necessarily at the river mouth. It's, depending on your watershed, wherever they put those representative monitoring sites.
Right. So what I'm asking is specifically if there's one at the river mouth and it's positive, but there's one at the Grand Avenue Bridge, which represents all the east end of Ojai agriculture, and that's has no exceedance. Because there's a positive at the river mouth, is that going to capture everybody above, or would the growers, the properties above the additional monitoring site higher upstream, would they be?
I think I understand your hypothetical, and I believe the answer is no, because the higher site would represent those sites. So they're taken care of by that higher site, the higher farms, taken care of by the higher in the watershed site.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then my last thing was just sort of a point. I think this is going to increase costs for growers substantially. And somebody asked about funding, and I don't think there is going to be any funding in the near future. And I think that's a problem. I'm part of various watershed councils in the county, and I know those organizations that have moved water quality issues forward in the last few years are all struggling to find funding and their continued existence. So, you know, the board might look to continue the work that the state has done on the watershed councils that have actually made improvements, as opposed to sort of this other process, which is going to just add expense. Well, meanwhile, we lose the watershed councils and some of the other framework that's pretty robust at this point.
Thank you.
I'm a small grower, and this program is going to create excessive, burdensome paperwork and expense for me. And I think, Maureen, can't VCALG help us at all with this? And what are the penalties if we don't comply?
I'll let Maureen take the first part of that question.
Hi, I'm Maureen. I'm with the Farm Bureau, for those of you who don't know. So the Ventura County Irrigated Lands Group is run through the Farm Bureau. So we're obviously in a developmental stage, but in terms of the two different tracks, VCALG does not have the infrastructure to assist with individual monitoring. That would require I think a QAPP is a 200-page document. It requires intense evaluation on site. That's not something that we believe is in the spirit of the coalition that is built to share costs with everyone. So where we're going to put our energy into building infrastructure to support farmers is in that track 2, where there's an implementation focused plan. And that's where we've been really talking a lot and developing recommendations and hoping that that those are going to be incorporated to build a practical program. So in our vision, and I think we're 80% there on what the staff is putting forward, and we're going to continue talking, would be that if you want to do individual monitoring, you're working with these guys. These guys are the experts in that kind of philosophy. If you're going to be working in an implementation focused program, then you're working with VCALG. So you're meeting all your VCALG requirements, you're connecting with NRCS, RCD, UC Cooperative Extension, or other technical service providers who are qualified to address your specific constituent, right? Whatever the issue is of concern. And so we would help you, and we're obviously pushing for things we think are going to make it practical, longer timelines and more inclusive ideas of what a technical service provider is, so that if you, Marjorie, have an exceedance, you say, hey, VCALG, I want to do an implementation program focus track. We say, okay, here's steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here's the people you can call to get your farm plan done. Here's the form you can fill out, and we'll help you with the reporting on that. Because the individual monitoring is is so specific. And it would, I think we did an analysis, it would take 50 employees in order to service that. It's way outside the scope of what VCAL can do. So we're trying to leverage the resources that exist, NRCS, RCD, et cetera. So that's our vision. There may be people who want to do individual monitoring. You actually have to provide a requirement for an alternative. So you don't have to be a part of VCALC. So that's my short answer. VCALC's position, what we're trying to work for and what we've consistently advocated for is action over monitoring. And then to continue the representative monitoring that we're doing. Is that good enough? Okay, thanks.
And the second part of the question, I think, was enforcement. And we do, the order, the conditional waiver and the order that we're proposing, those are enforceable orders. And we do use enforcement sometimes. If you look at our track record with farmers, there have been a notice of violation for not enrolling. And a notice of violation is kind of an informal kind of just, we're letting you know you should enroll. And a handful of other real small specific things. So, just because enforcement is a tool we have, but what we really want to see is improved water quality. We don't want a record of enforcing on people. That doesn't help improve water quality. So if you come to our board meeting on the 27th, you'll probably hear a board talk about accountability and transparency, because that's very enforceable. That's very important to them. So we're never going to have a permit that doesn't have any kind of enforceability, because accountability is clearly a goal of our board.
Okay, so I picked up on what you said about if there's an exceedance in a particular RA, then we can focus on this track too, because that's always where we're going. Are we trying to identify individually who's the big contributor to do that? Are we moving more towards more transparency to see which parcel is doing what, and do the nutrition management plans, are those public records that all of a sudden you look at those and say, hey, here's the dude that's got way too much going on and polluting probably. So I'm understanding, how does that work? The exceedance is if we're using the current sampling sites and we're not going to go, VCAL's not going to go monitor individual parcels, then where do we find out how to fix it?
That was a question for VCAL because you're looking in that direction. But yeah, yeah, I'll let them go first.
There we go. Hi, everybody. Jody Schweitzer with the Farm Bureau. One kind of point of clarification that I want to answer there, and it kind of goes to Mike Sullivan's question as well. And that's, how do you know if you are subject to these requirements? So right now, VCALG is structured by creating responsibility areas. Within those responsibility areas, there is one or more monitoring site. And what we see at those monitoring site drives the recommendations for best management practices for growers within that area. Some areas have multiple monitoring sites within that responsibility area. So exactly where to draw a dividing line between if one site is exceeding for that TMDL constituent and the other is not, that assignment of land area to representative monitoring site hasn't been done yet. So that's something that we're going to have to work with the regional board on to determine where those lines should be drawn, because that's not something that VCALG should be doing. That's a regulatory action. So there's some areas where it's more simple, where we only have one monitoring site within an RA, and there we can tell you that's your representative monitoring site. Other areas, it's more complicated. And so we're going to have those discussions with the regional board before we can give growers that information to let you know, here is your representative monitoring site for TMDLs. That would then drive the requirement to choose track 1 or track 2.
I think part of the question that I heard is kind of like, if it does kick off, what do I do compared to my neighbor? What if my neighbor is polluting more than me? Is that kind of what you're saying? So my understanding, or what we proposed, is if your TMDL is kicked off, you have a nitrogen exceedance. Everybody in that TMDL should put together a farm plan based on their plan. You know, you have someone from NRCS come out, they take a look and they say, oh, you know what, here's a slope, blah, blah, blah. You either contract with, or you take the nitrogen certification course. And so then you do everything that you can reasonably do to address nitrogen, and you don't worry about your neighbor. Right? So your neighbor does everything that they need to do in terms of BMP implementation, and they're working with a technical service provider. And if we can get enough neighbors in that TMDL to go forward with actual implementation of BMPs, and they're not all going to be the same. If you're in one area, or you have a slope, or you have a different crop with a different crop coefficient, you might have a different BMP, right? So it's specific to you based on what you're growing. Then those reports come to VCALG, and we tell, Elby and Anna and Elijah, hey, these guys are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and these guys aren't. And then they take that list of the people who aren't doing the implementation of the BMPs, and they approach them to do individual monitoring, or they move forward with that enforcement, right? And say, hey, you've got to get with the program, track 1 or track 2. So we're not, in the way that we have propose the implementation program, and as I have read it in the current draft, which is just a draft, there isn't any finding out who the culprit is within the TMDL. We just intrinsically think implementing that BMP is good for water quality, because that is, based on making physical changes in the field. And if that BMP is not appropriate to your field, then you create an evaluation for that. So I hope that answers your question specifically about the pathway.
Maybe another thing we can consider, maybe would help answer some of your concerns, is if something's triggered because a representative area sampling shows an exceedance, is that we also implement some additional sampling, more representative areas, to cut up the larger representative area into smaller representative areas. And you don't like that, I can tell. No, you have a skeptical look upon your face, sir.
No, I think that's a good first step. I think the other, there's another issue that a lot of the coastal folks and almost everyone on a watershed, all of the growers will face in this data, is that there are hundreds of people living in each watershed creating impacts, human waste impacts, nutrient impacts, hazardous waste impacts. I can't tell you the tonnage of hazardous waste that's been pulled out of just the Ventura River waterway alone. And so again, this survey style sampling is effective, but I think in a lot of places it's invariably going to show impacts that are going to land on the responsibility desk of ag, and they go far beyond ag's ability, even with all these well thought out, well implemented programs, go well beyond the ability of ag to change. And I don't think those impacts are being considered either by the regional board or the local authorities. And I feel like some of this is all of this because a lot of these folks, where do they live? They live in places where the police can't see them. And those places are on ag and the wooded watersheds, and they're not being characterized, and their impacts are not being characterized. And these programs will do nothing to fix that.
You're talking about unhoused? Yeah, yeah, and that really is a concern. And I tried to reassure you before, telling you about all the programs we have for the other sources of these pollutants. And we do have good programs for other sources of pollutants, and we don't have answers for the unhoused population. That's largely something that the local municipalities deal with. And it is really, they don't deal with it because it's a very hard problem. So. Well, yeah. That is a difficult problem, and we're definitely looking for more solutions there.
This is back to speak out. Because of that problem, can you move or add, say in the lower Ventura area, so you have a sampling point, set Main Street Bridge? Because we move out homeless every week, and they pollute the river like crazy, not just with human waste, with other waste. And it's an ongoing battle. So if you move a sampling point there, it would, it would say if that meets it and you got that human waste and they're still meeting the goal, then if there's an exceedance, then you could probably go back to the ag and take that out. Right now, everything's on the ag. So I'm just asking you if you're considering it, say move our sampling point down to the bridge.
We can, if she has a microphone right there.
Does this one work? I guess I need a mic now.
Yeah.
So I hear you, and I think it's something we can discuss. One of the advantages we have about where the sampling sites are is that they've been there for a really long time. And so we can see data over time and how things change. I think the real question is a philosophical question, and is monitoring the key to changing water quality? And so rather than VCALG being a mechanism to develop data sets to argue who's contributing to what, our view is that VCALG should be a coalition of growers who are working together to comply with the requirements. And so in creating a coalition of growers, we want to have the most effective, most inexpensive program that we can. We don't want to make the program be so focused on monitoring that no one can afford to be a part of it. And so we have high concentrations of monitoring, higher than any other area in the state. We're already monitoring more than anybody else, and we have really good data. And so our view is that we should focus on supporting growers in implementing best management practices, because we think if we philosophically accept that a best management practice is the way to comply, to impact water quality, on behalf of growers, then we don't need to spend millions of dollars. We already spend almost $1.5 million worth of money sampling. We don't, in my view, we don't need to spend more money sampling. We need to spend time, energy, effort in supporting everybody here in complying. Because at the end of all that monitoring is BMP implementation, where I think there's some areas to work on, because I don't want you guys to think that this is all worked out, is what does that look like? What is a BMP? What BMP qualifies and which one doesn't? The regional water board's asking for some quantitative evaluations, which is kind of also outside of that philosophy that I'm presenting. So just to clarify for you guys, in our position, our idea is keep the monitoring the way it is, that's been there since 2005, really good scientific monitoring, but not adding more costs to the programs for more monitoring, but rather setting up a system that helps people implement BMPs. If you feel like your specific area doesn't deserve to implement those BMPs, that's when you would go toward monitoring and evaluating your specific location, rather than putting additional monitoring on that, and that cost is borne by the rest of the grower coalition. So my view is, for example, the trash TMDL, which is an unhomed issue. For the trash TMDL, the way we comply is growers in specific watersheds, as usually 1/5 of the stakeholders do trash cleanups. So if we do the trash cleanups, we're in compliance with the TMDL. So you don't have to keep monitoring the trash. You don't have to get all of the unhomed people out of there. You just do the trash cleanup on a regular basis. And I think that that's a really good example of an implementation. Farmers are not responsible for solving the unhomed population problem here in Ventura County, but we are 1 out of 5 stakeholders in I think the Santa Clarita River watershed, Revlon Slough, and Ventura River Estuary. We pay 1/5 of the bills for the trash cleanup for the unhomed population. So it's an example of a implementation focused BMP that meets the compliance for that without ag being in charge of fixing this huge societal issue that we have, right? Yeah, so your question was, can we add another monitoring site, right?
Okay, let's just take nitrogen like it was brought up. If you have it for everything above, if you take it down, you don't have to do the river mouth, but closer in, then that would take care of all of the others. What are they? There are only 3 or 4 sites in ours. So you take care of them. I'm not asking you to take care of trash. We take care of trash. It is ag. It's not ours, but we still take care of it. We try to move the homeless. But I think if you had the TMT in the river and you say you got data, well, we've got data for 10 years and we show that the nitrogen level in the river is 5 to 6. But everybody, if you go 10.1, you're in the problem.
Right.
You're exceeding, which is not right because we're not affecting the groundwater or one of the people upstream. If they're 10.1, they're not affecting the river for the TMD, but you don't have any data on that. We do because we take data in the river.
Yeah, and it's loud. I can speak to that a little bit. So, the VCALG representative monitoring sites that we have in that responsibility area is collecting drainage just from agricultural lands. But we also are a stakeholder party for the LGTMDL stakeholder group. And in that group, we're paying a portion of the cost to monitor the river itself up through the various reaches of the river, collecting nutrient data, collecting algae data, all kinds of other water quality parameters. So that work is being done. And I think the heart of your question, though, it might be a better one for the regional board, is to say, if that water quality objective is being met and the receiving water, so Ventura River itself is meeting that 10 milligrams per liter nitrate is nitrogen, is that your point of compliance versus the point of agricultural discharge?
Yeah.
Is that
very,
better?
good?
Okay.
Jody, thank
So I'll punt that back to the regional board staff.
So you're asking if the receiving water itself is meeting the benchmark or the limit, but a discharge point is not meeting the benchmark or the limit. I think we probably should look at the permit itself and make sure that that's clear in the permit what that means. Because I've seen permits have gone both ways. Like you can't discharge. If you're discharging, don't discharge above the limit, is what way most permits are written. If we could do it a different way, it says, well, you can discharge above the limit because there's a assimilative capacity. We'd have to make, a positive evaluation that there's genuinely assimilative capacity. And maybe the fact that the river itself is meeting the limit might be evidence of that. But we should look at carefully at how it's written in our current order. Okay, let me get back here.
I had a question in regard to the presentation you made where you were talking about nitrogen in and nitrogen out, or you're talking about the amount of nitrogen that a plant absorbs and how much excess there would have leached through. I'm just curious where that data comes from. You know, as a longtime farmer, we pay attention to nitrogen if for no other reason that it's expensive. So we're not putting on any more than the plant tells us to put on. That is to say, we watch what the plant does and we can tell when it needs nitrogen. So I'm just curious where the regulatory standards for nitrogen needs come from to see how consistent they are with what we're finding that we have to do in the practical world.
Well, with the nitrogen applied, nitrogen removed ratios and differences, I believe is what your question is getting at, and how we get the nitrogen removed.
Yes.
as the plant uptakes it. So it's the responsibility of the discharger to report the crop yield. So like what's coming off your farm, and then the discharger group, so VCALG, multiplies that by a crop coefficient. Those crop coefficients are from scientific studies and just a lot of, and it's specific to the crop if available. So it just comes through research over time, and some of it's already available. Some of it will continue to be added, and there is a timeline for those crop coefficients to get approved, and they are approved by the regional board. And I believe it's after public comment. I would have to double check on the public comment. So that's kind of, so you take what your yield is, you multiply that by the crop coefficient, which is how much stayed in the plant essentially. And then you're left over with the nitrogen removed from the farm, potentially. And that's where that comes from.
Yeah, I understand the theory. I'm just wondering where the database is. Is that when you say it comes from scientific evaluation,
Yeah,
is that on through, does the board have it? Where is it?
No, so that's going to be, the discharger group comes up with the coefficients, but they use like the UC system does research on this, and that's where they get some of the coefficients, and it's from a variety of sources. It depends on the crop.
And we can make sure that we make sure that's transparent so that you can see exactly where that data comes from. I don't know if it's clear
Yeah.
in our order right now, but we can work with these guys and find out.
I just wanted to add a quick note to that. And so the California Department of Food and Agricultural's Fertilizer Research Education Program, they are the one who helps oversee this on a state level, and working with UC researchers to compile lists of coefficients per crop types. So the coefficients that have been improved for use in the Central Coast region and the Central Valley region will help inform the coefficients to be used here. But they're kind of the agency who oversees that. So it's not VCALG who's coming up with these numbers. It's CDFA FREP primarily.
Hello, how you doing? I have a question. Been working with a couple of growers in the Ventura County using crop monitoring stations. That stations, they have 3 type of lysimeters, 8, 16, and 24 inches. And we already control leaching. So is this type of report of analysis can be submitted as evidence?
As evidence that you don't need to.
That we're controlling the nitrate leachings?
I think it would depend on which track, right? So if you do track 1 with individual monitoring, no, it would only matter what's leaving your field or your tile drain. If you did track 2, then you would say the best management practice that I have implemented is using soil moisture monitors to ensure that I only apply the amount of water that I need in the root zone. And so I don't have fertilizer leaching, or I'm controlling it as much as reasonably as possible. But that would only count if your exceedance is a nitrogen one. If you have an exceedance that has nothing to do with nitrogen, if it's a bacterial issue or something, then you applying water in your irrigation system isn't the best management practice that would meet that requirement. So if you have a TMDL that says there's too much nitrogen going out into the waterways, then yes, in my view, or what VCAL's putting forward, that would count as a best management practice. But if the pollution in the waterway that's of concern is, for example, legacy DDT from, 60 years ago, then that BMP wouldn't count. So the best management practices that count for compliance have to have a connection to whatever the constituent or pollution is that's coming to that sampling site. Does that characterize your understanding also, LB, of the spirit of the
Yeah, I think that's a good
proposal?
answer.
I
Yeah.
would just add, if there is the irrigation and nutrient management plan, that has to be certified, and that's done prior to TMDL exceedance. This is something you do all the time. So I don't know when you said, is that exempt? Does that not leach? If you're getting towards if you can prove that you're not leaching into the groundwater, you don't have to do it. And if that was your question, if you have like physical evidence that you can present. to
Yes,
us, you
because
can
the
see
lysimeter, what it does
Yeah.
is gonna give you a soil solution for the root zone. So it's telling you how much nitrates you're having in the root zone. If it's leaching, it will see you there with numbers. If it's not, also will help you to control to not over fertilize and not leach. So it's not a moisture control. It's actually a nutrients fertilizer control. And that way you can help the grower to not leach to the underground. And my question is, with this scientific type of testing and sampling, we can prove to you the grower is not over fertilizing, it is not leaching, because we can measure the nitrates pound actually per acre.
So I don't have a direct answer of yes or no that counts, but you can send us some more information on getting that. I don't know without everything, but if you can prove that there's no nitrogen going into the groundwater somehow, that would be something that would qualify for that exemption. But I don't have a specific, like a hard yes or a hard no right at this time.
This is along the same lines of that, but a lot of us do soil testing and the labs come back and say, this is how much nitrogen you need. And I've always asked that be a source of information. I think it's more reliable information than me estimating what my crop production was, especially in years where lots of it doesn't get harvested and you don't have true numbers of how much crop is actually being produced. I think it makes so much more sense to go by your soil analysis that actually has true scientific numbers than these nutrient management plans that are depending on the weather, the temperature, you may be putting on more nitrogen than the plants need because they're not absorbing it, or depending on the method you're putting on it, might be running off before you even get a chance for the plant to absorb it. So I don't know, it just seems the nutrient management plans seem very broad, and it seems like it's a lot easier for us to use our actual soil samples or leaf analysis as our methodology for showing that we're not overusing.
So you're suggesting if your soil analysis shows that you don't have that much nitrogen, or your leaf analysis shows you don't have that much nitrogen, instead of, well, that could be part of your nutrient management plan, couldn't it?
Well, yeah, but so for example, like I grow lemons, and when I do my nutrient management plan, I calculate my production. So, but there was a lot of fruit this year that never got harvested, just hit the ground. So that wasn't accounted for in my nutrient management report. And I also just don't see how it can be regulated, because it is so broad and there's so many circumstances that if here's what I used, but that may not match which actually is going on. And here we have data that shows what's actually going on. I feel like that should be a better source, I guess.
As part of the nutrient management plan?
No,
Or-
instead of.
Okay, again, along those lines, you said, it seems like we're putting all our eggs in one basket of BMPs are the solution, but I was just wondering, is there a hybrid for the track 2 where if an individual grower decides to do some light emitter sampling or, his own individual monitoring, he's paying for, really zeroing in on what he's doing to the environment, that could get fed to VCAL and be just as good as a BMT to prove to the regional board that look, these guys are doing this and these guys are doing BMPs. So it all adds up to a better water quality.
I guess my response to that would be, you're going to create if this happens and it gets approved, right? This is all a draft. You'd create a farm plan, and that farm plan would be done with a technical service provider. And so if that farm plan is a mix of BMPs, you might already be doing, right? Micro sprinklers are a BMP, mulch is a BMP, cover crops are BMPs. And if you wanted to add in other things to characterize what's going on in your field, I don't see why that couldn't be incorporated into your farm plan, as long as that technical service provider was able to say, yeah, there's a connection here, right? So I have this area, I haven't figured out a BMP that I like or that's appropriate here. And so I'm going to propose that my BMP is to do X, Y, and Z. That would really be the technical service provider coming up with something that met your needs. But the individual monitoring option exists if you feel like none of these BMPs are something that I want to do, or I just prefer to do monitoring. So I don't want to necessarily say there's only eggs in one basket, right? There's a couple of ways to comply, but just understand that this is a format that the regional board needs to be able to enforce on. So what they're going to look at is, do you have a farm plan? Have you done an action that you said in your farm plan? Have you worked with the technical service provider, et cetera? So it's not really on VCALG to assist with making recommendations on how you create your farm plan. We're trying to provide a structure that says farm plans plus technical service providers equals compliance.
Hi, I'm Danny Pereira, and we operate a large vegetable operation here, and much to what Jürgen mentioned earlier, we've been from an economic standpoint forced to cut our nitrogen inputs years ago. This is something we've been doing. A lot of I just want the board to understand we're just not a bunch of yahoos out here over fertilizing. We wouldn't be in business if we were doing that. We've got moisture sensors out there. We are monitoring our nitrate usages. We do quick nitrate tests towards the end of the crop to ensure that we're mining the remaining fertilizer in our soils. A lot of work's being done already, and these best management practices that we're speaking of, I think, and I've got a good pulse of what goes on, in my area, and I just want the board to understand that we're working on this, and we've been at this for quite some time, and just want that understood.
Yeah, I think that's understood. I'm continually impressed with how much you guys are doing all the time and how much, VCALG advocates for you really well. And I think our board, particularly, they're the decision makers, right? I think they particularly feel that they do.
Just in that spirit, hoping that the regional board can also, again, look at those timelines of what it would actually take to create these farm management plans, the limited amount of technical service providers we have in this county. 3 months is just not enough for one RA or to develop plans site by site, and also try to minimize duplicity and allowing us to utilize existing nutrient management plans, gap certifications, testing to incorporate into this new required reporting, just to streamline it as much as possible.
Thank you.
Are there any questions online?
Just checking in online.
Well, yeah, I've been answering.
It'd be
Okay.
good to hear what the questions were from the online people and what those answers are, just so everybody has the same information, if you're willing.
We're kind of asking Elijah to be in two places at one time, so both online and here with us, so.
I was behind. I was typing. All right. There was a question about whether or not the recording would be available later. It's being recorded and should be available. That's an easy one. We had a question regarding in those areas where the benchmarks are exceeded, what are the observed public health issues identified? And this is a hard question to answer online because benchmarks are related to the specific uses of the water body. And most of our water bodies have many different specific uses. And so there's lots of benchmarks, and the effects are not just to human health, they're also to fish and wildlife. And so, sorry, I'm trying to read my answer. What I was trying to answer on this was that, you know, some benchmarks are to ensure public health, either due to physical contact with the water or through drinking. There's different benchmarks depending on the use. If you're drinking it, it's different than if you're just splashing in it. Some are based on fish and wildlife. And there was a follow-up question to that about whether or not the levels, the benchmarks are based in reality. And what the benchmarks come from, they're based on the best available science. And that's the full body of data that's available is how these are developed. So it's not something that's been, you know, picked out of the air, and it's based on the studies to date that are peer reviewed and documented. And the idea is, I think in the question, it was kind of asking whether or not we are seeing effects to human health in these areas with exceedances. And we don't look at it that way. Our goal is to make sure you don't ever see effects to human health. That's why we do this, or to the environment. So the data isn't looked at that way. It's looked at, you know, is it safe, and can the water be used for the uses that our communities are already using it for? And there was, I think, some question of whether or not that answered the question, but there's a lot of different impacts depending on what you're looking at. There was someone asked, when do we anticipate the new regulations going into effect? The current waiver that is there right now, it'll expire on September 30th. And we anticipate bringing the new waiver to the board in September. I think the meeting's the 27th of September. We had asked for a full year to develop the new regulations, but the direction we got from the board last December was that we needed to have something presented to them by the end of September. Someone asked about specifics. There's been a lot of questions regarding specifics of individual farms and whether or not they meet exemptions and things like that. My answers have been that for some of the specifics we can't get into on the online chat, but if you have questions, we want you to reach out to us. If you need more information, reach out to us directly and we can talk more in depth. Let's see. There was a question that kind of followed the question of the audience in terms of for any exceedance for which there are multiple potential sources, how do you determine the proportion for which ag is responsible? And along the lines of what was discussed in here, you know, when we develop and adopt a TMDL, during that development, TMDL staff gathers all the available data that's out there. And that may be MS4, that may be community group, that may be, we may go out and sample. The state has sampling programs. We try to gather all the available data. And then we look at that and we use the data, we use modeling and other tools, and we take the load that's identified in the watershed and we, using that information, we allocate it to the different responsible parties. So, you know, the question here was, why is it all going to ag? Well, in the TMDLs, it's not. There's a part of it, and that's how we break those up. Let's see. And we did have a question in terms of if there's water runoff in a hilly area above one agricultural farm that runs across that farm, how do you differentiate who's exceeding the TMDLs? The TMDLs are actually the compliances within the water body itself, not on the farms. You know, through the conditional waiver program, there wasn't a process of separating out which farm. You know, the new proposed WDRs, one way to do that would be the edge of field sampling. Now, that's not a popular, you know, choice. So that's part of this process, is we're trying to come up with another option. There was a question online about the impacts of the homeless living along the river and how those are being regulated. We know that it's a water quality issue. It's without a doubt. But those impacts aren't regulated through irrigated lands. They fall under other local, county, and state programs. Something that came up in the discussion was about the new drinking water notification, and that many ranch residents are not known or contacted by the ag tenants, that growers may not know the residents, how to contact them, and are not allowed on their properties. And in the actual order itself and the Appendix 8, which talks about the drinking water supply well, it actually falls to the operator or the owner of the property. So if you're the operator and you don't have access to the other tenants, that falls to the owner themselves, right? That would be, because it's owner, or it specifies in it that it's owner or operator. So if you're the grower and you don't have access to the other residents on the property, that would fall to the owner. That's the way I read it. So it's not just, I mean, there's part of this that goes beyond just the growers. It's also the landowners. There was a question, and Jody or Maureen, you might be able to answer this a little bit better. They were talking about how is dry weather monitored, dry weather sampling, and how it's being monitored. My understanding is your dry weather samples are connected to irrigation events, right? Is that correct?
Oh, so that might be the when. So we have fixed monitoring sites throughout the county that are collecting drainage from agricultural land. So either in agricultural ditches or in tributaries that are only draining agricultural lands. And we visit those same monitoring sites twice during the dry season and twice during the wet season. So wet season, we go out after we have a qualifying rain event of half an inch or in 24 hours. In dry season, we have a fixed date that we go out during those times, early in the dry season and then kind of mid dry season.
Okay, is
And
there?
irrigation would be occurring.
The question was, dry weather flows are not random as well. They're scheduled based upon field operations. And is this captured? How is dry weather critical condition being monitored? That it should not be random, but rather targeted based upon time discharge. So, but you have a set date.
Yeah, and so, we're not monitoring at the edge of a particular field. We're monitoring at the base of a watershed that's draining agricultural land. So it would be during a time when most growers would be irrigating. A particular grower within that drainage area might not be irrigating, but others likely would be.
I'll fix that answer. Here's a question that someone had asked. They said, I've been enrolled in VCALG since the beginning and paying fees since 2005, but have neighbors that still aren't participating. What is the plan for getting everyone to join? And we realize that there are some longstanding owners and operators that have not been participating, and they need to come on board. We are working on new plans for how we're going to approach this, getting ready to send out a new round of letters. Right now, most of our focus has been on developing the new order and the accompanying appendices, but that's high on our list, because it falls upon everyone, and it's not fair to those who are actively participating. And we understand that. And that's, I think, top of our list after we get through this effort. Someone asked, they are new to the area and they have some acreage, some of which they rent to a wholesale nursery. They haven't seen rainfall. During the recent rainfall, they noticed no water leaving the property, but it's all being absorbed in the soil, and they want to know if they're a discharger and if they're responsible for reporting and management, or is the renter. And the answer was that there's both a surface water and groundwater component, and that the property needs to be enrolled, whether that's either an individual or in one of the groups, and that I didn't actually answer part of the question, so I will go back and answer that as well in terms of who's responsible. Yeah. So, and then someone else asked, so the landowner would be responsible for sampling and monitoring. And the answer was, it depends on the circumstances, that it falls to both to make sure the requirements are met. And that if the owner isn't an operator or grower, the owner is responsible for making sure that the grower is complying with the permit. This is a fairly big issue in the LA County part of the region, because a lot of the growers actually lease from SCE or LA Department of Water and Power. And so we've had conversations with the landowners themselves about the fact that the leases need to be enrolled, and it falls to the owner to make sure that they are. That may be part of their lease. Yeah.
I think that's pretty relevant discussion here too, because we have a lot of people who rotate their crop. And so when you're thinking about track 1, track 2, if you're a landowner and you over a 2 or 3 year period, you might lease to 5 different operators. And what does that look like? Right. And I think that's where having feedback sessions on what those different tracks look like in their implementation is really important, because that's definitely a lived experience here in Ventura County, especially on the Oxnard Plains with vegetables and things like that. We'll definitely be looking at what is the practical application of both tracks.
And, part of this process is your community is, hands-on every day. You know what you're doing, what's working, what hasn't. If you have suggestions, we want to hear them. If there's, we're bound by the requirements of the regulations and the law, but our goal is to make the water usable for everyone, for all the uses that we have as a community. And, we want to hear your suggestions. So if you have them, please reach out. We will have the next phase of the written documents are the tentative drafts, and we anticipate those going out in July. So we have some time, and we want to hear from you.
As we wrap up I just want to make another pitch for April 27th. If any of you have any availability, because this is a formal board meeting, but I know our board, they like to hear from us. They like to hear from VCAG, but they also like to hear, from the people who are directly affected by the decisions they make. So they would really appreciate to hear from any of you. And you can also, with the formal board meeting, you can participate via Zoom if that's easier for you. And you can speak to the board via Zoom. You don't have to be in the room to speak to the board. So that's my pitch as we wrap up. Do we have any last comments as we finish up? Okay. 2 last comments. and then we'll- Yep.
There are some questions I probably am not going to get finished by the end of the workshop. So I will work on we'll get written answers. I think we can post them
Yeah,
online.
We'll
So
figure that out.
we'll get answers posted as well. Yeah. And some of them I need to do some research on. So
I think I had a finishing comment back here.
I just wanted to put a plug in for Ventura County farmers. Water quality, water preservation, protecting our soils and our farms are at utmost importance for us. And the issue that we all have is the burden of reporting. It's not the burden of conservation and protection. So I want to make sure that that is clear to your board and to your staff, that we are on board with protecting our resources. Many of us are an admin department of one.
Yeah.
Okay, so these requirements on top of all the other requirements that we're mandated to do are incredibly burdensome, and that needs to be front of mind. And Maureen and Jody are great advocates for us. They are very well aware of the issues we all face on our individual farms. So I would prioritize their suggestions and their comments and really take them as spokespeople for us and real factual issues that we're dealing with here. But we're pro water and soil. Don't get us wrong. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think there was somebody else who had their hand up for a last comment. Here we go.
I think the comment that was made earlier about those people not complying, this program's been going on since 2005, 18 years, and you have people who are not complying. They're not in this room, and in my experience, they're likely to be the bad actors. So if it takes 18 years and you're just sending letters, I think you need to strengthen your compliance, because the problem is not in this room. The problem is the non-compliers. The second one is in terms of crop coefficients for permanent crops, particularly when trees are replanted, it's 5 years before they produce any crop, so there's no fruit taken off, but the trees need nitrogen. So those crop coefficients need to take into account the fact that we're continually growing trees, not only just exporting fruit. The nitrogen doesn't all leave with the fruit, it stays in the trees, and it gets pruned and turned into mulch. And I don't know that, it's important that take into account. And then the third thing is, for those of us farming on the hillside, particularly in our watershed, and our monitoring source has been non-compliant for sediment and sulfur. And as the top grower, I can guarantee you that doesn't come from ag. That comes on to us. So there needs to be a way to clear that non-compliance, because the non-compliance is coming from the national forest and open space above irrigated ag. So that needs to be taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for giving us so much of your time today. I think I learned some things, and there's some things we're going to be going back to our order to see if we can improve. Thanks.
And then just before everyone leaves, if you did not sign in with VCalc, you're just here not with VCAL, please sign in on that notepad if you don't mind. And also there is information on how to find the administrative draft. Thank you.